Now that we've talked about the American presidency in great detail, I will now talk about the federal bureaucracy in, quite honestly, rather less detail. So we're going to look at a variety of issues here. I'm only going to hit on big picture things, and we're going to move along quite smartly and get this done quickly. All right, let's get started. Next slide. So at the outset, we want to point out that bureaucracies are inevitable. They are ubiquitous. They are everywhere. Inevitable like death and taxes. They are needed to run any organization of any size, from a one-man company to a 10,000-person company and larger. Bureaucracies are endemic to both public and private organizations, right? There's no avoiding them. Whether it's the U.S. Postal Service, or the Veterans Administration, or the DMV, or your cell phone company, or Nevada Power, or your gas company, the Walmart, right? And any organization, public or private. People often think bureaucracy, they think government. I'm like, who are you kidding? Bureaucracies are just as common in the private sphere as they are in the public. I think they don't sometimes get the credit that they deserve. They take a lot of flack here, no question about it, by we the people. Bureaucracies are given a very complex job to do. People don't realize how complicated it is, especially with a larger organization. And I would also point this out. Bureaucrats, and I can attest to this as a kind of a bureaucrat myself, as somebody hired by the state of Nevada to teach, that bureaucrats are torn between being rigid on the one hand, which in many ways makes a lot of sense, right? You want to, these are the rules. They're published ahead of time. Everyone's held to the same rules as everybody else. It's all very equal. And if anybody violates them, they've violated them, and that's got to be held to account. That seems fair, right? Equal treatment and all that. So on the one hand, there's that, right? And there's good reasons for doing that. We have rules for a reason, and if we start making exceptions, which is always the pressure, right? That's the other part of the equation. Bureaucrats are also under pressure to be flexible in particular cases. But if you make too many exceptions to the rule gets swallowed up by the exceptions. And if it was a rule that was there for a good reason, you've lost that good reason. You've been too flexible. Professors face this all the time. Yeah, I know the syllabus says this, but I had a death in the family, or I've been very ill, or I have too many classes and I couldn't meet deadline. And, look, as a human being, you're going to be inclined to say, all right, we'll cut you a break. Or, I don't have the prerequisite for this class, or I need to get in to graduate and it's full. Can you help me out? Right? On the one hand, you want to apply the same rules to everybody. You don't want the squeaky wheel to get the grease necessarily. But we're all human, and we try to make exceptions where we think it's fair. But once we make exceptions, right, think about it, then everybody else feels like they've been screwed over. Like, hey, you got special treatment, why didn't I get special treatment? And then the question becomes, is this bureaucrat handing out favors in a way that benefits his or her friends and family? It raises all sorts of questions like that, and it undercuts the rule in question. So it's a tricky thing, and there's no easy answer to that. I would just say in general that the larger the bureaucracy, and certainly that's what you're talking about when you're talking about the federal bureaucracy, those bureaucracies of necessity tend to be pretty rigid and pretty rule-bound. Otherwise, they can get into all sorts of trouble. Let us now talk about bureaucracy and democracy. We'll see that the bureaucracy is somewhat democratic, but only somewhat democratic, and perhaps that's a good thing. In terms of in what ways is the bureaucracy democratic, roughly 3,000 federal bureaucrats are nominated by the president with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. So there you have a democratic connection, right? We elect the president nominates these people, we elect the Senate provides advice and consent regarding these positions. These are the top positions, the leadership positions within the federal bureaucracy, roughly 3,000 of them. Now, only a handful of those are at the very highest level, like Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State, Secretary of Education, and so on. But they also have, within each of these bureaucracies, fairly substantial leadership teams, lots of diplomats, that sort of thing. So it ends up adding up to about 3,000. The president doesn't individually nominate all these people. That would consume too much of his or her time. Rather, they rely a lot upon their leadership team to come up with people to nominate for all of these many leadership positions within the bureaucracy. Leadership within the bureaucracy, they serve multiple masters. They are put there by the president, but remember, they're also they only get on to that job with the advice and consent of the Senate, so they also serve in some ways the Senate. We'll see that these bureaucrats also have to serve Congress in other ways. Congress provides their budget every year, so you're going to be responsive to the person who signs the checks, which is going to be Congress, not the president. The president is chief executive, technically the boss of all these people, but these people have multiple bosses. They just do. We'll see that also these bureaucrats serve their own particular constituencies. Secretary of Defense, right, is there partly to serve the men and women of the American military. So they got to be responsive to that particular constituency. They're going to be dealing with interest groups. Like if you're Secretary of Defense, you're going to have to deal with big industrial companies like Raytheon, because they're the ones who are making a lot of the hardware and software that you're going to be purchasing and using to create a powerful military. So presidents are frustrated by that, but it's a fact of political life. They name these people to the leadership jobs, but they compete with other constituencies for influence over this leadership team. The president can fire these people at will, unilaterally. The court has made that very clear. But we'll see that it's also true sometimes that the politics will not favor that sort of a firing. It can happen technically and legally. It may not be politically advisable. All right, so that's the leadership team, and you can see the Democratic connections and some of the issues the president faces. Technically, he or she is the boss of these leaders, but these leaders also serve other bosses in addition to the president. Checks and balances, right? There's also the rank and file. That's about 1.8 million civilian bureaucrats at the federal level. If you add in the military, it makes it closer to an additional 2.8 million. So that's those are the rank and file everyday civil service workers. They are not put there at the pleasure of the president. They do not serve Congress per se. They qualify for their job the way anybody would, right? You need to have the right degree, perhaps, the right certifications, the right experience. You have to do well, perhaps, on an examination, all of these sorts of things. This is the bulk of the federal bureaucracy by far. And they cannot be fired for their politics. They also cannot be too involved in politics. So they are protected from political retaliation. Also note here that the fact that they are protected from politics means that sometimes they don't respond to leadership the way leadership would like, because they're insulated, they're protected to some degree, as long as they do their job and do it well. You can be fired for cause, like in any other job, if you're with the federal bureaucracy, but you cannot be fired for your politics. Let's also note, people often bemoan the size of the federal bureaucracy, but if you looked at the size of state and local bureaucracy aggregate across all 50 states, much larger, right? Because what do state and local governments do? They employ millions of teachers, police officers, firefighters, and all sorts of other positions. So the aggregate of all state and local bureaucracies is infinitely larger than the federal bureaucracy. Moving along smartly here, and for a somewhat fuller coverage of this topic, check out those lecture notes. So when the president is deciding, who do I name to these leadership posts in the bureaucracy, what do they take into consideration? Hopefully number one, but sometimes I'm afraid not number one, competence, experience, qualifications, right? The same things that you would look for among rank and file bureaucrats, you would hope would be the president's first priority when nominating people to serve in leadership within that federal bureaucracy. And that certainly plays a role, of course it does. Is it always a primary role? Probably not, but that is certainly one factor that the president takes into consideration. A second factor, political and ideological loyalty. Hey, look, bureaucrats are making crucial policy decisions all the time, right? Congress will do something like, say, like back in the day, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. What does Congress know about those things at the level of scientific detail? Damn near nothing. They are generalists, not specialists. So what did Congress do when they created these federal laws? They said, look, we don't know what the details are. How do you make that happen? What kind of technology? How clean is clean enough? Nothing can ever be 100% clean. What's acceptable? We're going to leave that to the EPA, to the Environmental Protection Agency, let's say. So a lot of those crucial policy details get left up to the bureaucrats to make crucial determinations. How clean is clean enough? What kind of scrubber technologies are required for coal-fired electricity plants? How much lead in the air is acceptable? How much is unacceptable? Set those rates. Enforce those rates. Right? These are determinations made by the bureaucracy. And a lot of these are freighted with politics, inevitably freighted with politics. So what's the president looking for? People in the leadership team that will promote the president's agenda. I'll give a simple example. Let's say that you're a Republican, you're pro-business, you're pro-U.S. Chamber of Commerce. What's your position going to be on coal-fired electricity plants? You're going to say, look, these create jobs. They create cheap fuel, cheap energy. They help employ an awful lot of people. They make the economy go. Sure, it's not as clean as it could be. We'll expect some level of clean, but we don't want to set the level so high that the power becomes too expensive, people get thrown out of work, consumers suffer, right? So they're going to promote that sort of an agenda. There's much to be said for that kind of an agenda. So the head of the EPA under a Republican is probably going to have somewhat lighter standards on coal-fired electricity plants. They're going to say, look, do what you got to do. We'll maintain some standards, but we're going to maybe relax them a little to maintain other values that we think are important, like employment, the price of the electricity being generated for the consumer. Versus, let's say, a Democrat who comes in and says, hey, I care about the economy as well, but I'm going to put more emphasis on the environment. I'm going to require tougher standards on these coal-fired electricity generating plants, which is, by the way, still how we generate most of our electricity. We're moving towards renewables, but coal is still center stage here. So, a Democrat is going to put in position a leadership team that is going to be tougher on the coal companies, right? Different choices by different administrations. So what do you want from your leadership team? A leadership team that can do the job, but can also promote your political values. Nothing wrong with that, right? You expect that. If you elect a Republican, you expect the EPA to go a little bit lighter on, let's say, coal-fired electricity generating plants. If you elect a Democrat, you expect in some ways quite the opposite. More pro-environment, a little less focused on maintaining low prices for electricity, and so forth. Those are just different value choices. One's not necessarily better than the other. They're different. Different administrations have different priorities. So that political and ideological loyalty becomes very important. So you need that, right? You need people who are on the same page with you politically. Good at what they do, but also conservative if they're a Republican, liberal if they're a Democrat, let's say. You might also be looking for personal loyalty, right? Somebody who you believe has your back, will fall on their sword for you, especially in those high-profile positions. Personal loyalty. This is often why a president, when they become president, will bring in their leadership from back in the day when they were still not that famous, not yet president. Harry Truman did this with some of his cronies back in Kansas City, Missouri. W. Bush did it with some of the people back in Texas. Obama did it with some of the people back in Chicago, right? You bring along the people that you knew back in the day. People who were loyal to you before you were a big deal, right? It's kind of like athletes and celebrities today. You're going to have your entourage, and some of that entourage is going to involve people that you knew back in the day. Because once you're famous, right, everybody wants to be your buddy. Who was your buddy before you were famous? So that's also what presidents look for. Sometimes that serves them well. Sometimes it doesn't. Right? Sometimes these people, they have a lot of loyalty, but they may not have the competence. Presidents, you can't have everything in one person. All these traits that we're looking at here on the slide, no one person possesses all of them 100%. So you make choices between them sometimes. So sometimes if you select for loyalty, you may lose experience and qualifications. If you choose for political and ideological loyalty, you may lose, again, competence and experience. There are trade-offs here in all of these cases. Finally, patronage, right? That's alive and well in America, always has been, always will be in any democracy. It's the lifeblood of party politics at the state and local level. How do you get people to raise money for you in your campaign? How do you get people to work for you for free early days when it looks like you may or may not get elected? You have to say, hey, work for me, put in the time, and if I get elected, there's going to be a reward for you at the end of the line. So patronage is also part of the game. No question about it. If you raise a lot of money and that person gets elected, they will reward you with a nice position within the government. No question about it. It's very quid pro quo, really. That brings us to, very quickly, Hurricane Katrina, Michael Browner, put there as head of FEMA by President W. Bush. Why was Browner head of FEMA? God knows. His background, I think, was in running a thoroughbred horse racing association. And you're like, well, why did that guy end up as head of FEMA that deals with emergencies like Hurricane Katrina? What the hey? Well, he raised a lot of money for W. Bush. He was well connected. He hung out with people who owned thoroughbred horses. He was able to raise a ton of money for the president. That got him profile. It got him a reward. And I'm sure W. Bush thought, yeah, the guy has no particular experience that fits here, but what the hell? What could go wrong? Well, something did go wrong. Usually you can get away with that. This time you didn't. So patronage is also part of the game, no question about it. Particularly for those positions that are below the highest level. Because you always figure what could go wrong. And mostly something doesn't go wrong. Diplomats, this is an infamous area where patronage counts for a lot. If you want to be the diplomat to Great Britain, you better raise a ton of money. If you want to be the diplomat to Nigeria, you don't have to raise as much money. Some diplomatic posts are more prestigious, quite honestly. Some are less prestigious. And sometimes you end up with diplomats who don't speak the language. They're not well suited to their job, but they raised a lot of money. They thought it would be cool to be a diplomat. What the heck? Now, they're often served by a team of civil servants that help them get the job done, even when they're not all that well qualified. So it works. And it's not ideal. It's the result of patronage politics. But it's necessary. You know, it's not always pretty. Politics is not always pretty. But hey, that's what makes politics happen at the state and local level. That's what makes politics work at the level of I may or may not win this election, work for me anyway. And without that, it would be hard to make any of that happen. So we can decry it and denounce it and wish that it would go away. It will not go away. It's part of politics. It just is. All right, so those are some considerations that any president takes into account when they're deciding who should I nominate for my leadership team in the federal bureaucracy. Finally, and moving along quickly, many would argue that within the federal bureaucracy, you do have the problem of iron triangles. These are these maybe too cozy relationships between top bureaucrats, key members of Congress, typically heads of various committees, and interest groups. So you might have, let's say, the head of the Department of Agriculture working closely with the Senate Agricultural Committee, working closely with interest groups that are interested in agricultural policy. Let's say that you're Walmart and you would like to see a broad definition of organic because you want to mass market organic products, which I think of as kind of more the domain of hippie farmers somewhere up in Northern California. Walmart, that's not going to work for Walmart. They need huge amounts of product. They need corporate farms producing this product. They want a definition of organic that encompasses these large corporate farms. So they are going to lobby, right, the head of the Department of Agriculture to create a definition of organic that is simpatico with Walmart's interests. Same thing for key members of Congress that serve on the Senate Agricultural Committee, right? They'll also be lobbied intensely by, let's say, Walmart. Same thing with an agribusiness like Cargill or Archer Daniels Midland, right? They're going to have a strong stake in the rules created by the Department of Ag. And here's the concern. What are these top bureaucrats doing? They're passing through government fairly briefly, right? Civil service is there to stay. Top-level leadership, they come and go with each new president, if not sooner. So their job tenure is very short. Are they thinking about their next career move? Of course they are. And if you are head of the Department of Ag or part of the top leadership team for the Department of Agriculture, might you like to work for Walmart after you leave government service? Might you like to work for Archer Daniels Midland? Might you like a position with Cargill? Heck yes. Does that sometimes give you an incentive to be maybe too cooperative with these companies while you're doing your job as a regulator? It's definitely possible. It's definitely possible. That's the idea of an iron triangle. Who gets shut out of this? We the people. It's a cozy relationship between top bureaucrats, key members of the Congress, and powerful interest groups. Who gets left out? Ordinary people. You get political inequality, even the potential for corruption. So this is definitely an issue with any bureaucracy, even in a democracy, maybe particularly in a democracy. All right, we'll leave it at that. Thanks.